Hello and a warm welcome to this week's edition of Invest Africa. I'm Godfrey Mutizwa. Now, there is a sense of urgency to kickstart large investment infrastructure projects on the African continent. After years of low investment, African governments are aiming to transform their economies with infrastructure at the core and also create jobs. This week, we will be looking at Africa's top 6 infrastructure projects and unpacking some of the challenges that come with managing these large-scale investments. Tumiswa Mahanyele brings us this report.
Africa has seen unprecedented economic growth in recent years, and with the rising middle class, a mushrooming of the African population, and rapid urbanization, global cities will need to be more sustainable.
Absolutely critical, particularly to the landlocked countries that have abundant resources. So whether it be coal or copper or some of the other minerals, getting those materials to port is critical.
Whether it is turning on a tap, accessing the internet or transporting goods across borders, Africa's infrastructure has been perceived as less reliable and expensive. Financing costs, skilled labor and efficient project management are just some of the factors holding back development.
It is very important to implement regional projects when it's not a priority. There's the issue of ownership of this project. That is one. There's also the issue of harmonization of regulation and rules across boundaries. There's also the issue of financing this infrastructure project. And now we are talking about the private sector involvement in infrastructure development. But we have to be careful because some of these infrastructure projects are perceived as public goods. So it's not very easy to get the private sector to just jump into it.
According to the African Development Bank, a shortage of water, housing, roads and adequate sanitation reduces the output in sub-Saharan Africa by as much as 40%. Despite all the challenges facing infrastructure development on the continent, there have been some very impressive success stories. The latest Infrastructure 100, released by KPMG, identified the top 100 infrastructure projects in the world, and 6 of these projects are from Africa. Among the 6 is South Africa's Durban Waste to Energy project. Another proudly African project is the BRICS cable, which is among the largest and most ambitious project on the 100 list. The BRICS submarine cable is a 34,000-kilometer underwater fiber optic cable system that will link the cities in the BRICS economies, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa with the USA. This project is aimed at substantially improving broadband capability on the continent. With projects like these setting the standard, transforming Africa's infrastructure seems to be on the correct path. And the current infrastructure boom will not only support urban cities, but will also be able to provide for grassroots communities. Tumiswa Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Joining me now in the studio to discuss the state of infrastructure on the continent with a particular view on the top 6 infrastructure projects are Boy Scott. He is Head of Infrastructure for Africa at KPMG. And in our Lagos Bureau, we've got Wale Shonibare. He's Managing Director, Investment Banking at UBA Capital. And on the line from Nairobi, Kenya, we'll be joined by Gabriel Negatu, the African Development Bank's East Africa Regional Director. Gentlemen, welcome to you. Let's begin here in Johannesburg. And just perhaps give a little context around these top 6 projects. Now, these are chosen by KPMG, well, under the umbrella of KPMG, but by experts across the whole spectrum, from architects to perhaps academics who look at these projects and decide these projects are good. Let's just celebrate the fact that we've got top 6 projects that are coming from the African continent that are part of the top 100 that are being chosen by KPMG. Why were these projects part of this large group of the top 100?
Good afternoon, Godfrey. I think it's important to appreciate that it's part of a study that we, as KPMG, did together with Infrastructure Journal. It's a partnership that started 2 years ago, where we were looking at issues around big cities. Throughout the world, big cities right now already comprises 50% of the population of the world are urbanized. That's rapidly growing. It's expected that over 1.3 billion additional people will be added in the developing world. Africa per se is expected to grow up to 70% of the entire population in Africa big cities. That big cities in the world in area comprises a mere 2% of the livable area, on the continent.
Right.
So that means, in simple terms, the infrastructure in cities are under severe pressure.
Yeah.
And it needs to be looked at differently than before. You can't just look at a power station or a road or a hospital in isolation. It's now time to look at these all on a consolidated basis. Have a master plan. Make sure that these projects are meaningful, that they are sustainable, and that they make a contribution. This project looked at 10 various sectors, from health to transport to communications to education, etc. All the typical infrastructure areas, identified throughout the world on an independent basis 100 projects. 6 of them are from the continent, looking at size, sustainability, innovation, etc. And that's where the 6 from South Africa through independent panels were elected.
Yeah, so 6 from Africa are on that top 100 list. But we do know that, of course, I'm glad we're now moving the discussion further from do we need infrastructure, where do we need the infrastructure, how much do we need? Because the discussion around the fact that there isn't enough money going around to pour into infrastructure has been going for a long time. So let's just look at some of the projects. Some of them are not your typical ones. For instance, I was looking at the list here and I saw this one that came in on the Durban West to Energy project. Ordinarily, when we talk infrastructure, we talk the hard stuff, your railways, your roads, your power stations, as you were saying. So let's just briefly discuss the Durban one.
I think the Durban one, for example, falls into the waste to power energy sector. And if you look at the 5 criteria I mentioned, one of which was innovation and something meaningful, something different. Waste to energy in Africa is waste in Africa per se is a real issue that needs to be dealt with. The Durban Waste Project, with the methane gas that's released in these waste dumps, will have the capacity to provide electricity to between 5,000 and 6,000 households. Now imagine you can replicate that throughout the continent.
Yeah.
Now that's what that project was all about. It was elected because of those contributions it's making.
Yeah. Well, let me come to you in Lagos and speak about whether you think the top 6 that have been identified here are perhaps omitting bigger projects that in your view perhaps should have been on this list.
Yeah. Hello there. Any project list is going to be subjective because it depends on the criteria being used to pick those projects. But the main issue to recognize is that there are some key infrastructure sectors where we've identified a big gap across Africa, and the main ones being power, transportation. Telecoms to a certain extent has been a success. So if you go to any country, you can pick your 6 projects, either in terms of size or level of innovation or the contribution that it will make to economic growth. In Nigeria, there's a particular issue with power. So the power sector privatization that's going on here is very critical to economic growth over the next few years.
Yeah.
Having said that, there are also independent power projects that are being pursued. Each of these are significant in their own right.
Yeah, but while the fact that perhaps that didn't make this top 100, that was chosen, as I said earlier, by professionals, including academics and guys who are in construction, finance, law, and public policy, and all those kind of things, doesn't that perhaps suggest that perhaps it's not on the scale that it ought to be, and perhaps it just wasn't maybe outstanding enough?
Well, I wasn't party to the drawing up the criteria, so I'm not quite sure what criteria were applied. But certainly these are significant projects in terms of the impact they're going to have on the general populace and also the extent to which they're able to raise living standards that bring more people out of poverty. So
yeah.
I think, Yeah.
Okay.
So that's my view. We can always have discussions about which ones should have made the list and which shouldn't.
Absolutely. Let's take the conversation to the African Development Bank because, of course, they do look at the continent as a whole. Mr. Negatu, let me come to you and ask, I'm hopeful that you heard the projects that we're talking about, but maybe let me just quickly run through them. Is the BRICS Cable Project, is the O3B Networks project, the Durban Waste to Energy project that we discussed with Dibash, as well as the Blue Line of the Lagos Railway Network in Nigeria, Ethiopia's Djibouti Railway, and King Mamo Hato Memorial Hospital in Lesotho. Mr. Negatu, from where you stand, are those the big ones, or are they the bigger ones that didn't make it here?
I don't think there is any shortage of big projects in any region in this continent. I think, of course, big is a relative word, but still, in the east, if I may take, for example, Kenya, they've got some huge ones. The LAPSET project with envisioned infrastructure from Lamu to South Sudan, railways going all the way to South Sudan and into Ethiopia. In Uganda, in the same thing, some huge hydro powers and so on. So I haven't seen this list you are talking about, but I suspect there's really no shortage. And these that you have mentioned, at least I know of two of them, the Ethio-Djibouti and the Blue Line, definitely are huge, are big. Now, what criteria was used to cut off and at what point the cutoff was set, I'm not sure, but I think they're big and worthy of financing.
Yeah, I'm using the six to spark debate and, get us talking about what we need to do, of course. I mean, from where the African Development Bank stands, I do know that the bank is focusing quite a lot on infrastructure development across the whole of the African continent. In terms of what you guys have done and the amount of work you have put in, how much more do you think we ought to be doing? And from a bank perspective, perhaps just give us a sense of what you are doing.
Well, you're quite right. We are very heavily committed to infrastructure work in the East Africa region and across the continent, I should hasten to add. But let me talk about East Africa. We have invested quite heavily, and we are online to do much more. As I said, Kenya has huge projects in the pipeline relating to the LAPSET project. Uganda has some major infrastructure projects, including possibly a pipeline, hydro projects. Tanzania, the same thing. We're scheduled to do the electricity backbone connecting by a transmission line Tanzania and Kenya. That will form part of the East Africa power pool, which will then connect to the Southern Africa power pool, so power can be traded between Eastern and Southern African countries. Rwanda has two or so hydro projects coming up. And then we've got the NELSAP project, which connects by grid, power grid, all of the East African countries. So in total, I think we are set to do quite a bit. The same with the road sector, the same with ports and so on. So infrastructure will remain a flagship sector for us in the coming years.
Absolutely, and we'll continue that conversation when we go into the second half. For now, we need to take a quick commercial break. Please do stay tuned. Welcome back to Invest Africa, where this week we are talking about infrastructure on the African continent. Still with me are my guests, Dibash Scott, Head of Infrastructure for Africa at KPMG. And from Lagos, we've got Wale Shonibari, Managing Director, Investment Banking at UBA Capital. And on the phone from Nairobi, Gabriel Negatu, the Regional Director for the African Development Bank. Let me begin with you, Dibash, and just talk about the challenge of managing these very, very complex projects on the African continent. We do know, of course, that one of the things that Africa lacks is skills and management expertise. Just in terms of the overall trend in costs on these very, very big projects in most of the time, just give me a sense of what kind of trend you're picking up in just in terms of the costs.
I think that is one of the key challenges, Godfrey, in any infrastructure project, is how to manage that. You know, it's all fine and well to go through the feasibility studies and the procurement and how to structure it, and then to find your partners and then to manage it going forward. Now, there's fairly sophisticated processes that has been developed that are available for project and contract management post-financial close, and to make sure that on a very regular basis that all the milestones, all the thresholds, all the targets are very carefully looked at, that red lights are picked up when they should be picked up, far before they are red. So processes are available. And quite frankly, as we are speaking, are being utilised in Africa, in the continent already.
But what are we seeing in terms of those costs? Are we seeing a trend higher upwards? Because often when we speak about Africa, we say there's lots of opportunity, but also it's high risk. But at the same time, your returns are better. But if your costs are escalating out of line, you are unlikely to be able to realize those returns.
Yeah, I think the control of the costs are improving. I think the basic quality of contracting is improving. As more and more transactions are being done, as the legal frameworks and the regulatory frameworks and the banks' involvements are, more and more increasing, the likelihood and the recurrence of serious cost overruns out of control, is less of an issue.
Yeah, Gabriel,
still an issue, but less of an issue.
Yeah, Gabriel, you of course at the African Development Bank, you work with African governments to help them manage these large projects. What are you doing as a bank to help them have the infrastructure that will help reduce the costs of these projects?
Yeah, thanks, Godfrey. This issue of cost management is a concern both to the bank itself and to our member countries. And there are several sort of explanatory factors, if you will, why you get overruns. And as the previous speaker said, there are some good progresses being made, but it still remains that the timely procurement processes are causing cost overruns. The failure to properly prepare and package projects, unrealistic implementation schedules, technical and financial lack of technical and financial audits, and of course would be remiss if we didn't talk about corruption also. So all of these are indeed adding to cost overruns and becoming management problems. But we are working with member countries. What we do, Godfrey, is when we give a loan or a grant to country X to build 100 kilometers of road, we also attach some grant money, free money, to help build the institutional capacity of the roads authority in a given country, so that the engineering side, the procurement side, the management side is all addressed, so that it reduces the transaction time and cost of completing these roads. In addition, we are doing very close supervision and audit, value for money audits in terms of roads. If it costs $1 million to build a road, 1 kilometer of road in Kenya, and $1.5 million in Uganda, then we are doing an audit to find out, besides the geographic differences and the topographic differences, why is it costing so much? And of course, we're finding different types of reasons, and we are working to address all of those. And this is true across the continent.
Yeah, and of course that will continue to be a continuing challenge. But let me ask you, Wale, now you of course are inside a bank that does lend for infrastructure projects. Are you seeing a difference in terms of the interventions that the institutions like the African Development Bank are putting in to try and help governments reduce the cost of doing business and therefore be able to attract even more investors to come in and perhaps invest their money long term in infrastructure projects?
We get involved in raising money for projects, and we take projects to the likes of African Development Bank to provide the long-term financing required for these projects, because it's often difficult to raise long-term local currency financing. So African Development Bank has been very helpful in bringing in facilities to address that gap in the market. We're generally seeing more interest from all the DFIs in our markets, and interestingly, many of them are raising funds in local currency that they can then deploy into local projects, because they don't want the project sponsors to be worried about exchange rate risks alongside all the other factors that increase the cost of building and operating an infrastructure project.
Yeah.
So to that extent, the likes of the IFC, African Development Bank, and others are looking at different ways through local capital markets to raise long-term financing in local currency, and that's to be encouraged. UBA Capital plays a significant role in that process as our capital markets issuing house to help them raise the funds.
Yeah, but give us a sense in terms of the interest that you are seeing from institutions and organizations that want to come and invest in these long-term projects. Just how difficult is it to raise money? Let's say, for instance, one of the projects that made the top 100 here on the KPMG list is the blue line of the Lagos railway network. How difficult is it to raise the money that's needed for such long-term projects?
Well, the Blue Line is indeed an emerging success story in Lagos. Parts of the Blue Line infrastructure have already been built and they're to be seen. The basic infrastructure is being funded by government, but the private sector will run the rail services. It's getting easier because the first PPP that was done in this environment took about 4 years to negotiate, and other subsequent ones are being done more quickly because the templates have been established. The main issue is to have the right regulatory environment and legal framework to allow these projects to be done. And that's what allows the investors to be able to come in and deploy their funds, knowing full well that they'll be secured.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing is that there's significant amount of enthusiasm, but the projects are not emerging fast enough. There's probably more money around than there are good projects.
Wow, I like that story. I like that story. It's certainly the one that I'll be following up. And I'm glad you talk about the issue of regulatory and environments and improving them, because it's one of the issues that we raised with Presidents Jacob Zuma as well as Goodluck Jonathan in our debate that was held at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But let me come to you, Dibash, and talk about some of the issues that he raised. He says there's more money that's available for these long-term projects than there is projects becoming available. And yet we do know that there are a lot of projects that are happening, and the fact that we've got 6 in the top 100 suggests that a lot of these are coming through. And also what I heard from Gabriel is the suggestion that the African Development Bank is bringing a lot of these projects online as well.
I think exactly how much money is available is always the question.
Yeah, because we were discussing earlier, and we were saying there is a gap, and the gap estimated 2 years ago was that $93 billion annually is short of the money that needs to be pumped into the infrastructure.
Yes, and my comment at that time was that that gap is at least 50 billion rand, $15 billion, and it's a growing gap. It will continue to grow. I think the most important point is that, as far as we're concerned, money is not a problem on the continent. Money is available for proper projects, that's gone through proper rigor, that's been properly feasibility studied, that all the disciplines, and the gentleman from the African Development Bank touched on all those issues. It's been all the proper due diligences, all the proper audits have been done. The technical side is properly done. The value for money calculations are all done. Once a project has gone through a proper feasibility study process, that is typical to a normal PPP process, money is available for it. The problem is
the money is there.
There is money at that point of time. Is normally there. There are not enough people on the continent that are doing these feasibility studies, and there's not enough of them being done, and often funding for these studies are not that easily available. That's normally grant funded, etc. So it's a little bit of a catch-22 position.
Yeah, what do you bring first? Do you bring the infrastructure first, and then economic growth will follow, or do you begin with growth and then infrastructure to support that growth then comes along?
Absolutely, and how to take that first step to build a bit of track record and to build a bit of interest and to get the process going.
Final closing thoughts from you, Gabriel.
Final thoughts. Well, I think as the previous speaker just said, there is more money looking for good, bankable projects, where all the due diligence, all the technical specs have been sorted out. So the focus of our discussion should not only revolve around funding. Yes, funding is an issue, it's a priority, and we all need to be aware of it. But I think the greater need to focus ourselves on sort of clarity of purpose and fit of what it is that we're trying to do, get the technical and everything sorted out. And once we do that, I think we're well on our way. This continent, any part of the continent you pick,